I'm really looking forward to this talk today. One of the, when people often talk to me about environmental justice, one of the questions they may ask is like, what is environmental justice, or what is climate justice? And I often have a long pause because it's a complicated topic, right? And there's multiple facets to it. Today, we're going to hear some research that kind of actually provides an entry point to thinking about climate justice for those who are trying to, are interested in the topic, but maybe a little bit intimidated by all the complexity. So our speaker today is Kian Mintz-Woo, and he's a senior lecturer at the Department of Philosophy at the University College Cork. This is in Ireland. He's also affiliated with the International Institute for Applied Systems and Analysis, Equity and Justice Group in Austria. This semester, he is a visiting fellow at Princeton's Center for Human Values, and is a member of the Irish government's Carbon Budgets Working Group, helping to propose and support national planning. He works in moral philosophies, like sort of aspects of climate tax, climate pricing, and really looking forward to his talk today. So, Kian, welcome, and I'd like to hear from what you have to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Barry. Thank you all for being here. I know if you can't hear at all. I'm really excited to be here. I was really appreciative of the introduction and the invitation because it wasn't very many years ago that I was in those seats. In 2020, I was a postdoc here, and I was coming to these Bradford seminars regularly. So it's really exciting to be up here because I've learned so much through this series. So as Eric said, what I'm trying to do is give you some ideas about climate justice, and especially for those of you who haven't come to terms with these before, how you can use them, and a little bit about why they're important. And basically the idea of this is that if I give you these concepts, maybe it's relevant to your current research, maybe it's relevant to future research, or maybe you have a colleague and they're wondering how they can incorporate climate justice. This is a way of trying to get a grip on some of those concepts. So the first thing to say is that this is work done with many other co-authors, mostly at IASA, which is this institute in Austria that was just mentioned. So some of my colleagues there include Caro Zim, Jarmo Kijkstra, who does climate modeling, Elena Bruchin, who does global governance, climate global governance, Carl Scheinfinger, Keiwan Riahi, who does climate modeling, and these sorts of people. Okay, so why is this important? Well, there's been this demand from the especially climate modeling community, but also the scenario modeling community, to try to understand what justice could be. So in a scenario workshop in Bangkok fairly recently, there was a particular point in their report where they said there is a difficulty that modelers and scenario researchers and climate researchers more broadly have in understanding justice considerations. Now, this is an especially important community, very influential in climate policy discussions, but I think there's a lot of other communities across the environmental research space that might also have similar interests or demands. So you might think, well, we have terms to deal with this. We can talk about what's fair, or we can talk about what's equitable. I want to suggest that those are not going to do the work that we want. Why? Because they're very coarse-grained. What I think of as fair, you might not think of as fair. What I think of as equitable, you might not think of as equitable. It's not very informative. Philosophers would say it's not very thick. It doesn't give you a lot of information. So we need some terms that have more content, that allow us to more precisely diagnose what it is to be acceptable or unacceptable in a moral context. So of course, when there's trouble brewing, philosophers can and should come to the rescue. That's what we're good at. We help scientists get out of their various problems when we can. That's the kind of the attitude that I'm going for here. I think that what's relevant here is conceptual clarity. So what we want to do is we want to provide concepts that will help address these problems. Okay, to sort of set our system boundaries a little bit, what we're aiming for is concepts that are accessible, that multiple groups can understand, and particularly that can be understood without different particular disciplinary training, whether you have normative or policy or prescriptive training already. That it's powerful in the sense that a few concepts allow you to expose a large amount of justice discussions. That's really important to us. We want a few considerations that can allow you to access a lot of questions. And what we call modularity, which is the idea that these different, what we call forms, sometimes called dimensions, sometimes even called aspects, there's different terminology, these different types of justice are independent, at least in the sense that you can find which ones are more relevant for a particular line of research and use those as opposed to others. And why would we want this? Well, not only to answer the question of what these, in particular, modelers and scenario builders are doing, but also to try to make a space for dialogue, make a space where people can discuss across disciplines justice questions, and do so in a way that promotes, hopefully, understanding and, of course, hopefully, productive policy discussions. And even more specifically, the diagnosis is really important. What we want is when someone says that a particular, say, scenario or pathway is just and another says it's unjust, that they're able to have language they can use to figure out why they're disagreeing, exactly where they're disagreeing, what their different value commitments are. And then just as a last note, so I'm visiting Princeton briefly, and a big part of my reason for visiting is specifically to find ways that this framework might be useful to practicing scientists in various areas. So if you are or you know people who this might be useful for, please get in touch. That's exactly why I'm here, and that's what I'm hoping to look for, either while I'm here or indeed when I go back home. So the result of this was a recent piece. This came out earlier this year, basically laying out some different aspects of climate justice. So the way we do it is we break these questions of justice into what we call area, scope, and form at the first course grain level. So the area is what we are applying the justice concept to, what we're interested in. The scope is how broad the discussion applies, who owes justice and who is owed justice, and the form of justice. And form, one of the things that's kind of difficult about this is that the justice is discussed in many different literatures, and there's different terminology associated with it. Part of what we're doing actually is somewhat of a terminology mapping exercise just to get these different terms on the board. But what we call a form of justice is sometimes called a type of justice or a dimension of justice, sometimes even a pillar of justice. All of these are roughly equivalent. Okay. So as I said, the area is the subject matter that we're applying to. In the particular climate context that I'm especially interested in, we might be thinking about mitigation, we might be thinking about adaptation, we might be thinking about climate loss and damage, we might be talking about impacts. These are the kinds of things that we might be especially interested in. Of course, that's not an exhaustive list. When we're talking about the scope of justice, we mean who is affected, who owes justice, who are the subjects of justice, who are the patients of justice, how broad are we considering? Now, this is especially relevant when we're talking about a modeling context. You have to have system boundaries. Maybe it's regional, maybe it's domestic, maybe it's international, et cetera. All these kinds of things are spatial in scope, but we might be temporal in scope as well. We might be interested in how far are we looking in the future? What are we talking about intergenerationally? Are we talking in terms of cohorts and so forth? One particular aspect from the economic perspective is discounting, which of course involves how we weight the impacts over time. That's highly relevant, especially in the climate context where costs are front-loaded, benefits are back-loaded. When we're talking about discounting, that involves this temporal scope as well. And finally, as a philosopher, it behooves me to say that one way philosophers have discussed this is in terms of the expanding circle. And the idea is that we morally consider, over time, we've morally considered broader and broader groups. So maybe, historically speaking, it would have been a very wealthy, elite, land-holding male group, then maybe women, other races. And at this point, hopefully, we try to consider humans, but we might even go further than that. We might consider non-humans of different types, maybe sentient beings, maybe even living beings more broadly, and maybe even something broader than that. So our colleagues in Guillot might be interested in ecosystems as a source of a locus of moral responsibility. They might think it's important that there are certain kinds of interspecies relationships that are maintained as opposed to being focused on individuals. All of these are possible ways of thinking about who's being considerable, what scope we're talking about. And of course, it's probably worth mentioning Peter Singer, who was at this institution and recently retired, is one of the most influential advocates of moving beyond the anthropocentric to the sentientist sort of group. Okay, so that's sort of at a high grain level, coarse grain level, what are we talking about? This area, scope, and form. And then we can talk about different forms of justice. So when we were selecting forms of justice for this project, we wanted to do the ones that we thought were most relevant to climate researchers. And those we thought were distributional, procedural, recognitional, corrective, and a new one which we developed, which we call transitional justice. Again, these were selected in terms of their power and modularity, power in terms of their expressive potential, modularity in terms of their being mostly or completely independent. Okay, so let's talk about the first, distributional. So distributional also breaks down further, so I'll do that now. So here is the main diagram from the paper. This is our schematic framework. Let's see, I think I can use this mouse. So we have here the area of justice at top. We have the scope of justice, both temporal scope and spatial scope. We have the different forms of justice, distributional. In some disciplines, equity is used as an approximation of what we're calling distributional justice. Not in all, but that's a rough approximation. Procedural justice, corrective justice, which is responding to historical wrongdoing, recognitional justice, and as I said, this new form which we call transitional justice. There is, of course, in the literature, discussions about transitional justice. We're using this in a different sense than it's usually used. And then, I don't know how well you can see on the slide, but distributional breaks down into these bottom rows. There's a metric of distributional justice and a pattern of distributional justice. And I'll get into those in a moment. So, distributional justice involves a metric, sometimes called a currency of justice. This is the thing that we are distributing in some sense. And it can be proxied by an indicator or an index. These kinds of things help us get at what we think is actually morally important. So for instance, we might think what's morally important is that people are in good health. We can proxy that by calories. We can proxy that by exposure to PM. Welfare, we might proxy by consumption, and so forth. We don't usually think of consumption or calories as being independently morally important. We think that they are helping us get at something that we think is fundamentally more important. Then there are the patterns or shapes of justice. So for instance, we talk about egalitarianism, prioritarianism, sufficientarianism, and there's some more we discuss in the paper. So as you would think, egalitarianism involves how close we are in an ideal amount of the metric being equally distributed. Prioritarians care about having weighting more for those who are worst off. And sufficientarians think that there's some threshold, and it's a priority or overriding moral importance that people get to that threshold. You might think of certain kinds of rights as being very closely connected to sufficientarianism, and so forth. And there's others we talk about in the paper as well. It's worth flagging something here. If we don't explicitly think about our metric and currency of justice, then we might sort of default into certain things that are commonly used, especially in the modeling community, and those would be roughly welfare utilitarian positions, where distributions are about trying to maximize aggregate welfare. I'm not going to say that that's the wrong view to have, but I want to just point out that it's part of a space of justice considerations that we might take, and it's important to be explicit or at least conscious that we're taking that position if we do take that position. So when we have a metric of justice and we add a pattern of justice, we create what we call a theory of justice, which is just a combination of those two. Now, in the climate community, especially the policy community, we often talk about equity principles. And I want to suggest that these equity principles can be mapped onto this structure, this framework, in a particular way. So for instance, equal per capita emissions, where we converge, sometimes contraction and convergence, which is usually between countries. Equal per capita is usually individual. These could be patterns that roughly fit with egalitarianism. There's an idea that the goal is some sort of equality. Whereas certain development objectives might be seen as sufficientarian. The idea is that people should get to some level. It's really important that we bring people who are below that to that level. So maybe in terms of energy justice, do people have sufficient energy to live a decent life, to access certain minimal kinds of standard of living, and so forth. The Green Development Rights Framework might well be sufficientarian in this way. Okay, so that's just to help you see where these fit in this space. The next form of justice. So when we're talking about procedural justice, we're interested in how decision-making is done, and in the context of research, how the research decision-making is done. So the philosophical literature has discussed this quite extensively, but usually in the context of politics or governance. So they're interested in democracy. They're interested in the justifications for democracy. They're interested in why other forms of governance might be better or worse, how they represent the will of the people, these kinds of questions. Since we're aiming this at a climate research or environmental research community, our thoughts are a little different. We're interested in which kinds of tools, models, and input data are selected. How do you go about making those decisions in a research context? Now, I want to say that this is quite hard. And the reason it's quite hard is that often these kinds of decisions are guided not by normative or prescriptive ideas, but by practical things, right? So maybe some data set is available, or some data set is accessible and usable for a particular purpose. Maybe it's even incomplete, but at least it gets you some way towards answering some question you're interested in. So I don't want to say that this is only a question of justice. There's all kinds of practical considerations come in too. But I do think that it's important to think about these in terms of how they might reflect the kinds of conclusions you come to. Do they allow you to access vulnerability and exposure? Do they allow you to understand how differential or heterogeneous impacts affect either spatially, intertemporally, et cetera? And the other thing we think is important about procedure, and this does start to tie into the governance question, is how do we as a research community communicate with policymakers? Now, of course, here in SPIA, many of us are in communication with policymakers, and those conversations are difficult, and often we're not trained for them. How do we communicate uncertainty? How do we communicate our system boundaries and all of the challenges that we have? But we can think about this as governed by procedural justice, because ultimately those ways that we communicate can inform policy, especially in a storied institution like Princeton, and that means that we have a certain responsibility to think about how those are received, who receives them, and so forth. Okay. The next form of justice we call recognitional justice. So when we're talking about recognitional justice, we do it a little bit differently than some others. We think of it as there's two main axes of recognitional justice. So we think of as who is involved in the decision-making or the research process. So remember, the procedural was how are the tools selected, how are they operationalized, who is doing it, and which kinds of literatures and questions they're responding to. We think of that as one branch of recognitional justice. And then the other we think of as sort of how the outputs are used. This is a little bit different than how it's done in the literature. So we think, look, as research scientists, we come up with certain kinds of results. We communicate those results. They end up sometimes informing policy. But that policy is often sort of very aggregated, very top-down. And the question is, how could it respond to the particular conditions on the ground? So our view is that on the one hand, we have this question about sort of the composition of researchers, the composition of the literature that the researchers are responding to, global north, global south, gender, nationality, socioeconomic class, but also in implementation. And this is really important because when we're talking about policy, the success of the policies is highly sensitive to how it's being integrated, right? So maybe that's about what kind of resources or accessibility different people have on the ground. Maybe, so an obvious example is indigenous groups. Indigenous groups have particular pathways, life ways, different social cosmologies, ways of understanding the world, and these might highly influence how to import various kinds of policies. Another kind of issue might have to do with how they're communicated. Maybe the trusted people in a community are very different depending on the community, and that's relevant for how we implement these. So we view these as a part of recognitional justice. And again, this is challenging. It's challenging both to do, and it's challenging to understand exactly what the right kinds of views about why this is relevant. So one argument that's been used to discuss this kind of view, to support it, is that there are epistemic benefits to having diversity. By having different kinds of people in the room, we might ask different questions. We might be interested in different kinds of research. We might be sensitive to conditions that are not obvious if we're more homogeneous. The next form of justice I'm going to discuss is corrective justice. So corrective justice requires, for philosophers, that there was historical wrongdoing, that someone did something that requires correcting. So a precondition for this is that there is historical wronging. Wronging is a strong term in philosophy and in law. It requires more than just someone was harmed. Someone can be harmed by accident, for example. Wrongdoing requires some other conditions, rather complicated, and it would be hard to give here, but it's a strong claim. So the obvious question in the climate context is, do we think that past emissions are wrong? There's a lot of debate about this. So some might think, for example, that it's excusable that some people emitted in the past because they didn't understand the physical, climatic, and other geophysical impacts that could generate. Some people think that it's not wrong because it's not wrong if they respond in the correct kind of way, and so forth. I'm not going to address that here, but I just want to point out that it's not simply corrective justice when you're responding to historical harms. It's when you're responding to historical wrongs, and then there's the question of what is a wrong. Okay, let's grant that there is a wrong. Then the question is, what do we do? There's a few different branches of response, some of which we address and introduce in the paper. So here's a quick introduction to some of them. So first is maybe it requires compensation, which is kind of obvious. Some cases we have damages. Those damages can be addressed with the right kind of resources to rebuild and otherwise address the issue. We might think that there's some sort of restorative justice in the sense that there's some sort of status quo ante that we need to restore. Now, restorative justice also has a lot of different meanings, but in this case, what we think of as being there's a past state that we might want to recreate. This is especially interesting for the ecologists because there's a lot of issues in biodiversity trying to recreate historical ecosystems or ecosystem dynamics. Then there's the question, especially relevant in the United States, or especially discussed in the United States, of how we would decide which historical point or set of points is appropriate. In social systems and human systems, of course, we have analogous questions. But some might think that those are very practical. We need something that's more respectful in a certain way. So some people think that it's also important, or maybe important instead, that responding to past wrongs involves acknowledgement or recognition. So we might put this under the category of symbolic reparative justice or reparative justice, somehow responding to past harms in ways that are not about compensation. One philosophical distinction that I think might be of interest here is the distinction between what philosophers call backward-looking and forward-looking considerations. A backward-looking consideration or a backward-looking principle is one that involves responding to the causal or historical context that generated it, whereas a forward-looking one is independent of those considerations. So for example, if the polluter pays principle is backward-looking in the sense that we're interested in who polluted, and there's other sort of branches of that we call beneficiary pays principle, whoever received the benefits of historical wrongdoing, they owe some sort of compensation. That's again backward-looking. In contrast, we might think, no, whoever in the world as it exists is best placed to address the wrongdoing. They should do that. We call that ability to pay or capacity to pay. There, it's not about historical connection to the problem. It's about what can be done at this point. We would call that a forward-looking consideration. So corrective justice, by definition, is interested in backward-looking considerations. So the last form of justice, and this is the most novel form of justice I'm going to discuss, we call transitional justice. So the idea here is that when we're thinking about pathways, especially just transitions, we're interested in both what we're trying to get to and how we get there. So building on John Rawls and John Simmons, we use transitional justice to indicate what we call the justice dynamics of temporal pathways. So this contrasts with the distributional justice, which is concerned with static or end state positions. Where are we aiming at? So let's suppose we're aiming at a more egalitarian distribution. The question of how we get there and what kind of pathways or scenarios are appropriate or justifiable is what we call transitional justice. Again, that's terminology that we're developing. It's a little bit different than how it's been used in literature. In the climate policy community, transitional justice comes into play in what's sometimes called policy sequencing. So this involves questions of how we might introduce carbon pricing as opposed to command and control legislation, and how those play off against each other, because the dynamics might indicate how effective these kinds of processes are. So all of that is transitional justice within a particular form of justice. So if we have something that's distributional, how do we trade off against, say, short-term unequal outcomes in order to get to longer-term more equal outcomes? An alternative is to think about, and we think this is more conceptually ambitious, and we call this a meta form of justice, transitional justice about different form of justice. How would we balance different forms of justice, which we think can come out very often in the context of climate policy? So on the one hand, considering the same form of justice, say distributional, how can we trade off between something that's less distributionally just in the short term for something that's more distributionally just in the long term? So here's an example of a principle. You might think that we have to be monotonically increasing in distributional justice, so it has to always be at least as just as the previous time point. But you might also think, no, if you could have something that it passes through a less distributionally just midpoint in order to get to a very distributionally just endpoint, that's justifiable. We put that under this first form of transitional justice. But we can be more ambitious and think about different forms of justice, different dimensions of justice, and how we might trade off against those. So the kinds of examples there's many kinds of examples, but you might think, for instance, what about a community that is either socioeconomically, racially, or indigenous, or otherwise vulnerable to socioeconomically, and that group's rights or capacities might be infringed upon in building a grid that might have positive outcomes for, say, energy distribution or distributional justice in the end. Is that permissible? We're not, so one thing that in the paper, to be very clear about, is our goal is not to tell you what the correct answers to any of these questions are. These are very, very difficult questions, and honestly, many of these questions, I don't know what the correct answers are. But we do think that there's an important role for having the right kind of terminology and framework to understand these questions and be able to point them out and make them explicit, such that when there's disagreements, we know why we're disagreeing. So for instance, if I say a particular pathway is just and you say it's unjust, with transitional justice, we can figure out that maybe you think that if it infringes on this indigenous community, then that rules it out. We should think of that as a side constraint, and it shouldn't be, we shouldn't allow that pathway. Whereas maybe I think that's bad, it's unjust, but maybe the outcome justifies it. That's a disagreement that we could reasonably have, and I think with this we have the terminology and the conceptual space in order to distinguish those. Okay, so just a couple of words about how we could use this. So with my colleagues at YASA, we're trying to elicit different distributional justice intuitions. I know that there's some colleagues here that are doing similar kinds of things. So I put this in for Melissa and colleagues. So when we're thinking about these, we might have different kinds of pathways that represent schematically these different forms of justice, and we might try to test how different individuals in different communities, what their views are. So again, this is another view of the sort of schematic differences. So for instance, here we have clearly very egalitarian. These different countries or world regions, let's say, are converging. Here, this is sufficientarian. It's very important that we bring those that are lower to some antecedently important threshold. Here, there's just increase, so it's something like utilitarian maybe. Here, there's it's important that those who are too well off do not stay, that we limit the growth of some areas. Now, that might seem really counterintuitive. It's called limitarianism in the political philosophy literature. But it's, in some areas, it's actually quite intuitive. So if you're thinking about something like calories, we might think that it's important that no one gets a very large amount of calories and that those are redistributed. And then finally, we have something that's roughly prioritarian. Those that are lower off are weighted more heavily. It's important that they grow more than others. So this is something we gave to some colleagues at the International Vienna Energy and Climate Forum. There's some other venues where we've been trying to run this as well. Now, this is very preliminary, and this is definitely not representative, but this is just some idea of what we got from a few colleagues when we tried this. So here you can see that which kind of metric we were interested in can have significant differences. So for instance, as I said, limitarianism, the idea that it's from a justice point of view important that no one has very, very high levels of consumption is considered by these people much more plausible when we're talking about nutrition than when we're talking about, say, mobility. In contrast, when we're talking about economic activity, that seems to prime people to be much more focused on egalitarian views. This is just an idea of what kind of views we got there. Okay, so what's the takeaway? So this is supposed to be a modular framework, powerful framework in the sense that with these few concepts you can discuss a huge amount of justice ideas. We're not going very deep. This is a chance to introduce you to these concepts and give you the impetus to sort of think about them more carefully. It's modular in the sense that these are separable. Notice that that's why we have transitional justice and distributional justice separate, because distributional is about the time slice, and the transitional is about the dynamics. And by separating them, we think we get interestingly separate questions, and we think that's important to keep separate, especially for those who are interested in things like just transitions and scenarios. And hopefully, this is modular in the sense that these concepts are accessible to those in different disciplines, regardless of your training, whether it involves normative, policy, prescriptive things or not. And also, it has them all in sort of one simple structure, hopefully. Our next steps. We're hoping to build a model intercomparison project, which we call JustMIP. This is sort of started in EASA, and part of why I'm here is to get some Princetonian colleagues, some of whom are around, most of whom have gone to other places, together to think about NICE in particular. So NICE is one of the DICE offshoots that has been fairly influential here in this institution. So we want to think about that in terms of justice, but we're also interested in other kinds of models and how justice considerations may or may not be relevant. And we're very much, this is in early stages, we're trying to find some sort of schemas that allow us to do this in a systematic way. As I suggested in that operationalization section, this allows us to understand justice and elicit justice preferences. Hopefully that's something that is useful in terms of both understanding layperson and expert and researcher differences. There might be systematic differences in preferences or over metrics and patterns, and that would be, I think, useful to know or at least be sensitive to. We believe that this framework systematizes and translates this philosophical research for an interdisciplinary climate audience. I want to point that specifically that philosophical. There are many disciplines that discuss justice. So lawyers discuss justice, geographers discuss justice, sociologists discuss justice, and there's others as well. I would say those are some major ones. The way that I've approached it is philosophical. So it's sort of concept first. It's fairly abstract. There are pluses and minuses to that. I want to be really upfront about that. I think that the pluses are that it sort of abstracts away from complexity. It makes them hopefully more accessible, and hopefully, it makes it maybe something more like a neutral ground, something like this for different scholars with different areas or different people with different commitments. But there are minuses. When I've discussed this, I haven't talked about any of the sources or drivers of injustice, and those, of course, matter. But what we think is that having a neutral framework facilitates engagement with and investigation of those injustices and those mechanisms, but you need the concepts before you do that. And of course, ultimately, we hope that this provides concepts of justice which can promote successful discussion and diagnosis. Discussion in the sense of being a set of concepts which we can use to talk about these in a more fine-grained way than just what's equitable or what's fair, which I think of as very coarse-grained, and diagnosis in the sense of when there are disagreements, hopefully this gives you some concepts and vocabulary that you can use to distinguish about why you might think that something is just or unjust and where you might differ. And of course, this is aimed at researchers. We think that a similar pattern would be applicable to policymakers. And with that, thanks for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Kian. So I thought it was a really nice way to sort of organize thinking around justice principles. I'd like to open up the floor for questions. I'd like to start if there are any questions from students. I think to start, Melissa.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's good to see you. One, just to help me understand the framework overall, the question I have is on metrics. I'm curious why you were only positioning metrics within distributional justice and not the other forms that you could imagine that possibility as well.
Great question. So the question is, why is metrics listed under distributional here and not, say, up here overall with other things? So the answer is, the way that we're thinking about distributional justice is how we would distribute what we think of as morally important. Now, what we think of as morally important, the metric of justice, you can think of as what we're interested in, in which case it would be what we're calling the area. But in particular, if it's the thing that we are thinking of as morally important that we're focusing our research on, then I think it's important that it's packaged together with a pattern. Because the metric by itself doesn't tell us very much about how we would evaluate an outcome. For instance, if you think that welfare is important, then that would focus you on doing certain kinds of things, but you need to have an understanding of what kind of structure, distribution pattern of welfare you're interested in. So I think that that's not to say that the metric is not relevant to others. So for instance, when we talked about procedural justice, one of the things I said is what kind of data you're using, and that's highly relevant to the metric, obviously. But I would think of it as you have to know what you want to understand about the world before you start to think about the questions of what kind of data might help you understand that. Hopefully that answers the question. Yeah, thanks. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for this presentation. I was wondering, when you had the interviews, I think you said you interviewed NASA interviews?
EASA. It's a different organization. That's fine. That's fine.
NASA came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Thank you. But I was wondering, I think you said it was online, was the interviews, but I was wondering if there was any measure of how well they were understanding the different frameworks and if they were interpreting them differently, and how that might have related to the results.
Great question. So the question is, are NASA and EASA different? They are different. And the second question is, when we were doing this kind of justice preference elicitation exercise, did we have any check on how well they were understanding these distributions? And the answer is, this is really hard. It's a good question because that is really challenging. So we did. So we had qualitative questions. So we didn't do multiple choice questions of understanding. We did qualitative questions, which were about why you picked the thing you picked. So it wasn't actually online. What it was through an app, but in person, which is roughly similar, but has slightly different issues. So anyway, so here what we asked them to give us a short, I don't know, it was a few words explanation of why they, say, picked a particular distribution or not. And some of the answers suggested that they were not interpreting it the way that we thought we were. So that's difficult. And we're aware of it, and it's a good question, and that's why this is sort of first pass. We're trying to figure out how to do that. Because obviously, so one of the things we did was originally we had names, and then we were like, names are bad because then that predisposes certain, a lot of people think the word equality is good, for example. So if it says equality, then that price you go. So that's why we gave these symbols, which are, abstract things. And so that way, when they're picking, there isn't that. But do we think that they're picking it because it's converging or because it's above that threshold? The impression we got from the qualitative answers is that many of them had similar views on what these dynamics were doing, but not all of them. So yeah, that's hard. Good question, thanks. I think it was over here and then over there.
Yeah, I think sort of I really like the idea to set up a common framework for discussions about moral issues that end up being moral. I wonder how does that facilitate the actual discussions between people that have different moral stances on things. I mean, the example I'm the part I'm is the scope, which is, do you care about, I'm thinking about this in terms of human cooperation in general, but it can go further. Do you care more about yourself, your family, your country, the world and humanity, the biosphere, the concept of beauty of ecosystems, which is even further. I do have my moral stance on this. How do you talk and how does this framework facilitate discussing with people that have completely different views on this? And just maybe clarifying something as well, arriving to the state where you arrive at these distinctions of essential moral values is hard and is already part of a democratic exercise that is really interesting. And like the best discussions I've had with people that disagree with me, we managed to get there, but not further, obviously. So, yeah.
Yeah, those are great questions. So, so one way of putting the question is, given that we have different normative positions, what does, so, I mean, maybe this allows us to see some of those differences. Does it do something else? Another way of seeing this is, how do we actually respond to these disagreements? What does the political process look like after that? Those are both great questions. So let's take them in turn. So the first one, so yes, so I might care, I might have a more limited scope of caring. I might think that sentient beings matter. You might think that ecosystems matter, etc. So my personal view on this is that at some level, those are bedrock values. I don't think you can, well, you might be able to, but it's extremely difficult to argue someone into caring about more than they care about, for example. And on the margin, it might happen, but generally speaking, that's unlikely. So my view is that the goal of this is not to get everyone to converge, to have exactly the same ones. It's to be able to understand where they differ and what implications that has for the kinds of policies, pathways, and so forth that they support. So being able to understand that, I think, is an important step. Now, some people would go further. They would say there are correct ones. We should try to argue for our position and convince other people that are. So I'm a little bit more humble, let's say, than that in terms of what I think this can do. So that's, but some people might have more ambitious views. So that's one answer. The other answer is, what do we do once we have these differences in important policy contexts? And I think you're absolutely right that we have certain governance systems which adjudicate between people who have substantively different normative and political policy views. So actually, I'm going to be talking about this tomorrow a little bit. So my view is that what we can do is one thing we can do is we can try to find convergence between different normative positions. So you might have substantively different positions and you might get convergence. I actually think that a lot of climate action, certainly a lot of mitigation, can be supported. It's overdetermined. There's a huge amount of ways that you might support it. You might care about the long term. You might not care about the long term. You might care about local pollutants. There's a lot of things that are going to actually end up supporting aggressive climate action, I think. You might care about health impacts. You might care about environmental impacts. You might care about biodiversity. There's a bunch of different things that we might all care about, and we don't have to drop those in order to have some convergence on some practical things. And I think we should search for those and work with those as much as possible. So my general attitude in terms of that question is to look for big policy, big tent policies, places where people can converge. So I think that that's so let's say my position, as I said, is driven by the idea that we should be somewhat humble in the sense of it's not just I defend my view and you have a different view, so I should argue about it until you get my view, or vice versa. But instead that we can take our different values, understand where they differ and why they differ, and then see where we can find common ground. That's my view. No, other people might differ. Yes, there, and then there. Yeah.
Hey, okay. Thank you so much for this talk. It was excellent. I really do think this framework is a great way to sort of like bridge the gap between philosophy and policymakers and climate scientists. So my question might push things a little bit into the boundary of the political, and I'm trying to synthesize the critiques in political theory to John Rawls and Martin Nussbaum, and whose voices I hear in this framework, into a single question. And that question is, like, what is the role of the state here? Particularly when the state may not be particularly invested in sort of like neutral standards of justice and might exercise power unequally.
Yeah.
For example, we can look at Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and just yesterday in Asheville, North Carolina, where the state deployed police forces to guard businesses against like looting. The population is trying to get like bottled water when they don't have clean water or electricity or anything like that. And the preservation of private property is upheld over like serving the community in the time of like drastic emergency. So how does like that unequal exercise of power complicate like the sort of neutral framework that you're trying to aim for here?
Great question. So the question is, look, in the world as it is, access to power is unequal. State control can be capricious. It can be unjust. How does that interact with this context? So I can say something really quick, which is that to some extent that's outside my system boundaries because this was aiming at climate researchers, and it only at the very end point where it's saying how we would communicate our research results to policymakers. And I was saying you should be sensitive to how that could be done for exactly those kinds of reasons, because there's kinds of incentives in the political process which might be highly incommensurate with justice, let's say, right? Okay, but I think that there's a deeper question here, which is maybe is this too idealistic, something like this, and the real world is much messier. So I would take that critique on board. Yes, clearly, figuring out what is just is insufficient to enact justice, let's say. You need sufficient amounts of sympathy, understanding, aligned incentives, and many other kinds of big tents, and many other kinds of things to come together to actually make policies that are commensurate. I think, so I can say the purpose of this, I can say, is just in this very idealized sphere, and in the real world things are more complicated, and that's sort of outside of this particular project, which I think is right. But given that us and many of our colleagues are in SPIA and interested in these policy issues as they hit the ground, maybe a little bit more is worth saying. And the first thing to say is it's hard. I definitely grant that, that there are all kinds of bad incentives and people who are interested in self-enrichment as opposed to trying to promote just outcomes, absolutely. But I think that in this case, again, I think that there's a lot of overdetermination. So there's a lot of ways of promoting climate action in particular that don't need to appeal to justice. So that's relevant to some people who have the right, certain kind of motivations. But in other kinds of places, it might be reducing respiratory illness. It might be trying to contribute to various biodiversity or ecological benefits. So I think that there are multiple messages, and different kinds of audience might be relevant to different kinds of audiences, and that's maybe some way of getting around that. But of course, yes, I agree that it's difficult. Thanks.
Let's make this the last question. One more, okay?
Yeah, in the back.
So, yeah, thank you so much for this talk. I wanted to touch on this sort of two axes of definition of distributional justice, of who is involved in making the decisions and then who are the policies being enacted on. I think this is related to some extent to the concept of legitimacy, particularly in things like global environmental assessments, which
Yeah, another great question. So the question is, look, when I'm talking about this procedural and recognitional issues, one of the things I said is who's involved. We might think about stakeholders. We might think of different kinds of actors that this might be relevant to. And it was pointed out that this is sometimes discussed in the governance literature in terms of legitimacy. Is it representative of the right kinds of people and therefore acceptable in the right kinds of ways? And the suggestion was, well, in that literature and in others, there's a sensitivity to the idea that this might have trade-offs. You might have other. So, I mean, one obvious thing is the more stakeholders you engage with, the more likely you'll get dissensus. That's a practical thing. It might take more time. It might be harder to find the people who are willing to engage. But there were, I think, some more sophisticated things you were pointing to. But just very simply, there's a bunch of obvious ways that this might be trade-offs. So the answer is, I think that I definitely think those things matter. So part of what I was trying to get at some points was we might think of certain aspects of the research project in terms of justice, but we might think that there's other practical concerns that trade off against those. And I was saying that you might think that it trades off against how people are, what kind of data you have, how accessible it is, how well. So I think that there's something roughly analogous going on here. There might be practical things about translating it to policymakers and so forth, simplifying a story and all those kinds of things that are going to be harder when you have many more actors involved or many more points of view represented. So that's not to say that that's not still an aspect of justice. I think it is. It's just that there are other considerations, and justice might not be the end of the discussion. And I think that that's plausible. I think that justice is probably not the end of the discussion. It is a particular important set of considerations that are often not considered, but it's not the end. You know, there are other things that can matter in decisions in what philosophers call all things considered judgments. So I think that that's. I think that what's important is that we find ways to, again, bring people together, but also to be explicit about those trade-offs, to understand when we are trading off, say, justice considerations against other ones. And as long as we're cognizant of that, that's, I think, a big step towards becoming more just. So if any of you have other questions or want to get in contact, please don't hesitate. I really appreciate you coming, and thanks for your time and your attention.